The mall was alive with Christmas music and laughter when the German Shepherd locked eyes with the man in the red suit. Something was wrong, very wrong, and in 48 seconds, everything would change. Officer Marcus Webb had worked mall security for 12 years, but he'd never seen his canine partner Rex react like this. The dog's entire body had gone rigid, his ears pinned forward, a low rumble building in his chest that Marcus felt through the leash before he heard it. They were doing a routine patrol through Riverside Mall on Christmas Eve afternoon when Rex suddenly stopped dead in his tracks, staring at a Santa Claus who was walking quickly toward the east exit. Not running, not yet, but moving with purpose, with urgency. The Santa glanced over his shoulder once, and that's when Marcus saw it too. Something in the eyes. Something that didn't match the jolly costume, or the season, or the hundreds of families shopping around them. The man's face went pale when he spotted the police dog watching him, and his pace quickened. "Rex, easy boy," Marcus whispered, but his hand was already tightening on the leash. In 5 years of working together, Rex had never been wrong. Not once. The Santa's walk turned into a jog. The red suit swished around his legs as he weaved between shoppers, the big velvet sack bouncing on his shoulder. Parents pulled their children aside, confused. A little girl started to cry, and that's when the man in the red suit started to run. Rex exploded forward with such force that Marcus nearly lost his grip. The chase was on, but this wasn't just about catching a shoplifter or stopping a pickpocket. There was something else driving Rex forward with an intensity Marcus had never witnessed. Something the dog understood that Marcus didn't. Not yet. What Marcus couldn't know, what nobody in that crowded mall could possibly guess, was that Rex wasn't chasing a thief at all. He was racing to prevent something far worse, something that would only become clear when that velvet sack finally hit the ground and spilled its contents across the polished mall floor. Something that would change Christmas Eve forever for everyone in Riverside Mall. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand what happened that day, to understand why a trained police dog would break protocol and pursue a man in a Santa suit with such desperate urgency, we need to go back. Back to where this story really begins. 3 weeks earlier. The morning started like any other in the canine unit of the Riverside Police Department. Marcus arrived at 6:30 as he always did, and Rex greeted him at the kennel gate with his usual enthusiasm. The German Shepherd was 4 years old, in his prime, with a coat of black and tan that gleamed under the fluorescent lights and eyes that seemed to see everything at once. "Morning, partner," Marcus said, scratching behind Rex's ears. The dog leaned into his hand, tail wagging, but his eyes were already scanning the room, always alert, always watching. It was what made him exceptional at his job. Rex had been trained in detection work, specializing in narcotics and explosives, but his real gift was something the training manual couldn't teach: intuition. The ability to read situations, to sense danger before it materialized, to know when something was wrong, even when everything looked right. "We've got mall duty today," Marcus told him as he clipped on the leash. "Should be quiet, just the usual Christmas shoppers." Rex's tail wagged harder. He loved the mall. The sounds, the smells, the endless stream of people who wanted to pet him despite the working dog do not pet vest he wore. Marcus tried to enforce the rule, but Rex had a way of making children smile just by looking at them. And during the holidays, Marcus found himself being a little more lenient. The Riverside Mall was the largest shopping center in 3 counties, a sprawling complex of over 200 stores spread across 3 levels. During the Christmas season, it transformed into a glittering wonderland of lights, decorations, and the kind of controlled chaos that came with thousands of people hunting for the perfect gift. Security was always heightened in December. More shoppers meant more opportunities for theft, more chances for things to go wrong. The mall's private security team was good, but they'd requested additional support from the police department during peak hours. That's where Marcus and Rex came in. They walked their first patrol at 9 that morning, weaving through the crowds that were already building despite the early hour. Rex trotted beside Marcus with perfect discipline, his nose working constantly, processing the overwhelming symphony of scents that filled the air. Perfume from the department store, cinnamon from the pretzel shop, the leather goods in the luggage store, the crowd itself, thousands of individual human scents mixing together. But underneath it all, Rex could smell something else. Something that made him pause for just a fraction of a second outside a toy store on the second level. It was faint, masked by all the other smells, but it was there. Chemical. Wrong. He couldn't identify it yet, couldn't isolate it from the chaos around him, but it registered in his mind like a distant alarm bell. "What is it, boy?" Marcus asked, noticing the slight hesitation. Rex's nose twitched, and then he moved on. Whatever it was gone now, or too faint to track through the crowd. Marcus made a mental note, but didn't think much of it. Malls were full of odd smells during the holidays. They completed their patrol without incident and returned to the security office on the ground floor. The head of mall security, a former cop named Sarah Chen, greeted them with coffee for Marcus and a dog treat for Rex. "Anything interesting out there?" she asked. "All quiet," Marcus replied, watching as Rex carefully took the treat from Sarah's hand and crunched it thoughtfully. "How's your Santa Claus operation going?" Sarah grimaced slightly. "Don't ask. We're on our third Santa this season. The first one quit after 2 days because kids kept pulling his beard. The second one called in sick with the flu. This new guy started yesterday, and honestly, he's a little off. Good with the kids, don't get me wrong, but there's something about him that doesn't quite fit." "Off how?" Marcus asked, his cop instincts perking up. "Nothing I can put my finger on," she admitted. "He's always looking around like he's nervous, jumpy, probably just nervous stage fright or something. The kids love him, though. He's got this gentle way with them, especially the ones who are scared." Marcus filed that information away. In his experience, when something felt off, it usually was off. But Sarah was right. It was probably nothing more than a nervous substitute Santa trying to get through the season. But Rex had stopped chewing his treat. His ears were forward, his body alert, staring at the bank of security monitors on the wall behind Sarah's desk. One of them showed the Santa's workshop setup in the center court of the mall. The camera angle gave a clear view of the elaborate North Pole scene, complete with fake snow, wrapped presents, and a large chair where Santa sat for photos. The man in the red suit was there now, talking to a small boy while his child's parents stood nearby with their phones ready. The Santa was smiling, nodding, listening to whatever wish the boy was sharing. He looked perfectly normal, perfectly ordinary. But Rex's eyes hadn't left the screen. A low whine built in his throat, so quiet that only Marcus heard it. "What's wrong, buddy?" Marcus asked, following the dog's gaze to the monitor. He saw nothing unusual, just a Santa and a kid and the normal chaos of a mall at Christmas. Rex looked up at him, and I could have sworn he saw frustration in those dark eyes. The dog was trying to tell him something, trying to communicate something he'd sensed but couldn't explain. But the language barrier between human and dog was too great, and the moment passed. "Probably just wants to get back out there," Sarah said with a smile. "Rex loves a good patrol." Marcus nodded, but he wasn't so sure. Rex wasn't the type to get excited about patrols. He took his work seriously with a calm professionalism that sometimes made him forget he was dealing with a dog and not a human partner. They did 3 more patrols that day, each one taking them past the Santa's workshop area. Each time, Rex's behavior changed slightly. His steps would slow, his head would turn, his nose would work overtime, and each time he'd look up at Marcus with that same frustration expression, as if to say, "You're not getting it. Something's wrong." But nothing was wrong, not that Marcus could see. The Santa went about his job with patience and kindness. Children climbed onto his lap and whispered their Christmas wishes. Parents smiled and took photos. The mall hummed with holiday cheer. It wasn't until their final patrol of the day, just before the evening shift change, that Marcus noticed something that made him pause. They were walking past the workshop area when a little girl, maybe 5 years old, approached the Santa. She was tiny, with dark curls and a nervous expression, clutching a stuffed rabbit to her chest. The Santa's entire demeanor changed. He leaned forward, his face softening, and he spoke to her so gently that Marcus couldn't hear the words but could feel the kindness in them. The little girl's fear melted away. She climbed onto his lap, still holding her rabbit, and whispered something in his ear. The Santa's response was immediate. He reached into his bag and pulled out a candy cane, but more than that, he said something that made the little girl's face light up with joy. She hugged the stuffed rabbit tighter and nodded enthusiastically. Her parents, standing nearby, looked surprised and touched by whatever exchange had just happened.
It was a beautiful moment, the kind of thing that made Christmas special, but it confirmed what Sarah had said. This Santa had a gift with children, especially the scared ones. Rex sat down heavily beside Marcus, still watching, still tense. And that's when Marcus realized something important. Rex wasn't reacting to the Santa himself. The dog's attention wasn't focused on the man, but on the bag. The large velvet bag that sat beside the chair, bulging with what everyone assumed were props and candy canes and small toys to hand out. The bag, Marcus whispered to himself. You're worried about the bag. But that didn't make sense. What could possibly be in a Santa's bag that would concern a police dog? Rex was trained for narcotics and explosives, but surely nobody would be crazy enough to bring either of those things into a crowded mall during Christmas, would they? Marcus made a decision. Come on, boy, let's take a closer look. They walked casually toward the workshop area, just another patrol passing through. The Santa was between children now, adjusting his suit and taking a sip of water. When he saw Marcus and Rex approaching, something flickered across his face. Not fear, exactly, more like recognition, like he knew what Rex was and what the dog was capable of. Evening, Marcus said pleasantly. Just making our rounds. How's the Christmas spirit treating you? The Santa smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Oh, you know, lots of wishes to remember, lots of nice and naughty lists to check. His voice was warm, practiced, but there was an edge underneath it. Strain, maybe, or stress. Rex moved forward, his nose leading him directly toward the velvet bag. The Santa's hand twitched, like he wanted to pull the bag away, but he stopped himself. Moving the bag would look suspicious, would draw attention to exactly what he didn't want anyone examining. That's quite a bag you've got there, Marcus said conversationally. Must get heavy after a while. You have no idea, the Santa replied, and there was something genuine in his voice now, something tired. But it's part of the job, right? Can't be Santa without the bag. Rex's nose was inches from the velvet now, his nostrils flaring as he processed the scents. Marcus watched carefully, looking for any sign of an alert, the specific behavior Rex had been trained to display when he detected narcotics or explosives. But the dog didn't sit, didn't paw at the bag, didn't give any of the standard signals. Instead, Rex did something Marcus had never seen before. He looked up at the Santa, made direct eye contact, and whined. Not an alert, not a warning, but a question. As if the dog was asking the man something, trying to understand something that went beyond his training. The Santa stared back at Rex, and for just a moment his mask slipped. Marcus saw genuine emotion cross his face. Sadness, determination, and something that looked almost like an apology. Good dog, the Santa whispered so quietly that Marcus barely heard it. Good, smart dog. Then the mask was back in place. The professional smile, the jolly demeanor. Well, I should get ready for my next visitor. You gentlemen have a good evening. Marcus nodded and pulled Rex away, but his mind was racing. Something just happened. Some kind of communication between his dog and this man dressed as Santa Claus. But what? And why? They finished their shift and returned to the station. While Marcus filed his reports, Rex lay in his usual spot, but he wasn't relaxed. His head was up, his eyes open, staring at nothing. Thinking, processing, worrying. You want to tell me what's going on with you? Marcus asked as they drove home that evening. Rex rode in the back of Marcus's SUV, in the special canine area with windows cracked for ventilation. Usually the dog would rest during these drives, but tonight he sat up, alert, watching the world pass by. Marcus lived alone in a small house on the edge of town, a modest place with a fenced yard perfect for a working dog. Rex had his own space there, his own bed and toys and food bowls, but the truth was they spent most of their time together, whether at work or at home, partners in every sense of the word. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the way Rex had looked at that Santa, the way the Santa had looked back. There had been understanding there, some kind of recognition that transcended the usual human-animal barrier. And that bag. Why was Rex so focused on that bag? At 2 in the morning, Marcus gave up on sleep and opened his laptop. He started searching for information about the mall's Santa program, trying to find out more about this mysterious substitute who'd started yesterday. But there was nothing unusual in the mall's hiring records, nothing that raised red flags. The man had passed a background check, had references from other seasonal Santa gigs, seemed completely legitimate. His name was Richard Walsh, 62 years old, retired electrician, widower, no criminal record, no red flags whatsoever. So why did Rex think there was something wrong? Marcus dug deeper, searching for Richard Walsh in other databases, looking for anything that might explain the dog's behavior. And that's when he found it. A news article from 6 years ago about a house fire in another state. A tragic story about a man who'd lost his wife in the blaze, how he'd tried to save her but couldn't, how the fire department had found him unconscious in the yard, overcome by smoke inhalation. The man's name was Richard Walsh. Same age, same background. But the article included a detail that made my blood run cold. Richard Walsh had been an electrician, yes, but he'd also worked part-time as a demolition consultant. He had extensive knowledge of explosives and how buildings came down. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding. It probably meant nothing. Lots of electricians knew about demolitions. It was part of the trade. And the man had passed his background check, which would have flagged any concerning history with explosives. But Rex had been worried about the bag. And Rex was never wrong. Marcus made a decision. Tomorrow, they would watch Richard Walsh more carefully. They would trust Rex's instincts even if Marcus couldn't understand them yet. And they would be ready just in case that bag contained something other than candy canes and Christmas cheer. He didn't sleep that night. And in his bed, in the corner of the room, Rex didn't sleep either. They both lay awake in the darkness, thinking about a man in a red suit and a velvet bag. The morning started like any other in the K-9 unit of the Riverside Police Department. Marcus arrived at 6:30, as he always did, and Rex greeted him at the kennel gate with his usual enthusiasm. The German Shepherd was 4 years old, in his prime, with a coat of black and tan that gleamed under the fluorescent lights and eyes that seemed to see everything at once. "Morning, partner," Marcus said, scratching behind Rex's ears. The dog leaned into his hand, tail wagging, but his eyes were already scanning the room, always alert. Always watching. It's what made him exceptional at his job. Rex had been trained in detection work, specializing in narcotics and explosives, but his real gift was something the training manual couldn't teach: intuition. The ability to read situations, to sense danger before it materialized, to know when something was wrong, even when everything looked right. "We've got mall duty today," Marcus told him as he clipped on the leash. "It should be quiet. Just the usual Christmas shoppers." Rex whined softly, a sound of confirmation. "What are you talking about?" Sarah asked, confused and increasingly alarmed. "Mr. Walsh, what's going on?" He set the bag down slowly, carefully, with the gentleness of someone handling something precious. Then he sank into the chair behind him, suddenly looking every one of his 62 years and more. He said, "I'm not carrying explosives. I'm not here to hurt anyone. I swear on my wife's grave I would never hurt these children." "Then what's in the bag?" Marcus asked with his hand resting on his service weapon, just in case. Richard closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were wet with tears. He said, "Hope. I'm carrying hope. But you won't understand. Nobody understands. Try us," Marcus said. Gently, sensing that they were at a crucial moment, push too hard, and Richard might shut down completely. But show compassion, and maybe the man would explain what was happening.
Richard took a shaky breath. "My wife died 6 years ago. Cancer, not the fire. The fire was something else. Something I can't talk about. But she died in pain, so much pain. and the medications they gave her weren't enough. Near the end, she was crying, begging for relief, and there was nothing I could do. Nothing except hold her hand and watch her suffer. Sarah and Marcus exchanged glances. This wasn't what they'd expected. "I'm sorry for your loss," Marcus said carefully, "but what does it have to do with working as a mall Santa?" "Everything," Richard said with surprising intensity. "Don't you see? These children, they come to me with their wishes, their hopes, their dreams, and some of them are sick, really sick. I can see it in their parents' eyes, in the way they hold their children so carefully, like they're afraid they might break. I can see it in the children themselves, how tired they are, how much pain they're hiding behind their smiles." He stood up and walked to the bag, opening it with reverent care. "So I started carrying this." Marcus moved forward carefully, Rex at his side, ready for anything, but what he saw inside the bag made him stop dead. It wasn't explosives, it wasn't narcotics, it was medicine. Bottles and bottles of prescription medication, carefully labeled and organized. Pain medications, cancer drugs, expensive treatments that Marcus knew from his own research cost thousands of dollars. A fortune's worth of pharmaceutical supplies, all packed neatly into a velvet Santa bag. "Where did you get these?" Marcus asked, his mind racing through the legal implications. "I made them," Richard said simply. "I'm not just an electrician. I studied chemistry in college before I switched majors. After my wife died, I started teaching myself pharmaceutical synthesis. It took years, but I learned how to make these medications. The ones that cost dying patients thousands of dollars, that insurance companies refuse to cover, that leave families bankrupt and broken." Sarah's hand was on her phone, probably ready to call for backup, but Marcus held up a hand asking her to wait. "You're manufacturing illegal pharmaceuticals and distributing them at the mall?" "Not selling," Richard said fiercely. "Never selling. Giving. When I see a child who needs help, when I see parents who are desperate and afraid, I slip them what they need. In a Christmas gift bag wrapped up with candy canes and toys so it doesn't look suspicious. I write dosage instructions on pieces of paper disguised as Santa's notes, and I tell them to keep the magic alive." "That's incredibly dangerous," Sarah said, finding her voice. "You could be giving people medications that harm them, that interact with their other treatments. You're not a pharmacist. You're not a doctor." "I'm a father who watched his wife die in agony because she couldn't afford the medications that could have helped her. I'm a man who decided that if the system won't help these families, I will. And yes, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm breaking the law. But I've helped 17 children this season. 17 families who were at the end of their hope, who didn't know how they were going to afford another month of treatment. I gave them more time. I gave them Christmas." Marcus felt like the ground had shifted beneath his feet. This wasn't a standard case. This was a man doing something illegal for what he believed were moral reasons. But Rex's behavior suddenly made perfect sense. The dog had smelled the chemicals from the medications, had known something was wrong, but couldn't identify it as a threat because Richard Walsh wasn't a threat, not in the traditional sense. Rex had been trying to warn Marcus that the Santa was hiding something, but he hadn't known how to communicate that it wasn't dangerous. The dog's frustration had been because he'd sensed good intentions mixed with illegal actions, and his training didn't prepare him for that moral gray area. "Mr. Walsh, I understand what you're trying to do, but you're putting yourself and these families at risk. If someone has a reaction to these medications, if something goes wrong, you could be facing serious criminal charges, manslaughter even." "I know," Richard said quietly. "I know the risks. I test everything thoroughly. I research every interaction. I only give medications to families after I've observed them, after I've confirmed their prescriptions and diagnoses through careful questions. I'm not reckless, officer. I'm desperate. There's a difference." "How long were you planning to keep doing this?" Sarah asked. "Today was going to be my last day, Christmas Eve, the end of the season. I was going to disappear after this, move to a new city, start over. I've helped everyone I can help here." But then he looked at Rex.
Then this very smart dog figured out something was wrong, and I knew my time was running out. Marcus made a decision that could cost him his career. Sarah, can you give us the room for a minute? Sarah was shocked. Marcus, you can't be serious. We need to call this in. This is way above our pay grade. 5 minutes, Marcus insisted. Please. After a long hesitation, Sarah left, but Marcus knew they didn't have much time. She would be calling her supervisors, and soon this room would be filled with people who wouldn't see the nuance in Richard Walsh's actions. Once they were alone, Marcus sat down across from Richard. Rex positioned himself between them, looking at both men with what Marcus could only describe as concern. Listen to me carefully. What you're doing is illegal and dangerous, but I understand why you're doing it, and I believe you when you say you're trying to help. But this has to stop today. Not just because it's your last day anyway, but because you will get caught and you will go to prison and you won't be able to help anyone from there. I know, Richard whispered. But, Marcus continued, there are legal ways to help these families. Organizations that provide medication assistance, foundations that pay for treatments, social workers who can connect families with resources. Have you considered working with any of them? Richard laughed bitterly. Those programs have waiting lists that are months long, forms that take weeks to process. By the time the system helps, the children are dead. Maybe, Marcus acknowledged, but maybe not. And maybe if someone with your passion and knowledge worked within the system, pushed for changes, advocated for faster processes, you could help more people in the long run. Easy for you to say, Richard replied. You didn't watch your wife suffer. No, I didn't, Marcus agreed, but I've watched Rex save lives. I've seen him find missing children, detect explosives before they detonated, stop bad situations from becoming worse. And you know what I learned from working with him? The best way to help isn't always the most direct way. Sometimes you have to work within the constraints you're given to achieve the most good. Rex, as if understanding the conversation, moved closer to Richard and placed his head on the man's knee. It was a gesture of comfort, of connection, and Marcus saw Richard's face crumple. I just wanted to help, the older man said through tears. I just wanted these kids to have what my wife couldn't have. More time, less pain, a chance. I know, Marcus said gently, but that speaks to who you are as a person. But there has to be a better way. The door opened and Sarah returned with 2 other security officers and a mall police officer Marcus knew. The time for private conversation was over. We're going to need to confiscate that bag, the mall officer said, all business. And Mr. Walsh, you're going to need to come with us for formal questioning. Richard stood up, resigned to his fate. But before he could move, the building's fire alarm suddenly blared to life and chaos erupted. Red lights flashed, the alarm's piercing wail echoed through the security office, and outside in the mall proper, I could hear screams and the sound of thousands of people panicking. What the hell? Sarah grabbed her radio, listening to the frantic chatter from her security team. Her face went pale. There's smoke on the 3rd level, multiple reports of fire near the food court. Everyone rushed towards the door, including Richard, but Marcus grabbed his arm. The bag. Give it to me. What? Why? Because in about 30 seconds, this office is going to be chaos, and that bag is going to become evidence that gets locked away in an impound room for months. If there are families out there who really need what's inside, this might be your last chance to help them. So give me the bag. Richard stared at Marcus in shock. You're going to let me give them out during an evacuation? I'm going to pretend I didn't see you grab it in the confusion. What happens after that is between you and your conscience. But Walsh, after today, you stop this. You find another way. You work within the system. You volunteer with legitimate organizations. You do whatever you have to do to help legally. Because if I hear about a rogue pharmacist operating in another city, I will know it's you, and I will find you. Understand? Richard nodded, tears streaming down his face. He grabbed the bag and disappeared into the crowd of people rushing towards the exits.
Sarah was shouting orders, trying to coordinate the evacuation. The mall officer was speaking rapidly into his radio, calling for fire department response. And Rex was pulling at his leash, wanting to get out there, wanting to do his job. Let's go, boy, Marcus said. releasing the leash from the wall mount. "We've got work to do." They plunged into the chaos of the mall. The crowds were thick, panicked families trying to find their way to exits, store employees abandoning their posts, the careful organization of Christmas shopping devolving into survival instinct. Smoke was visible now, dark clouds billowing down from the third level, and the fire alarm continued its relentless wailing. Rex moved through the crowd like a professional, his training keeping him calm even as people rushed past in panic. Marcus followed, using his radio to coordinate with other responding officers, trying to understand the scope of the emergency. That's when he saw him, Richard Walsh, still in his Santa suit, moving through the crowd with purpose. But he wasn't heading for an exit. He was moving from family to family, stopping to speak with people, pressing small wrapped packages into their hands. The velvet bag was getting lighter with each interaction. Marcus watched in fascination as Richard approached a woman holding a small boy. Even through the chaos, Marcus could see the recognition on the woman's face. This was one of the families Richard had identified as needing help. The Santa spoke urgently, pressed something into her hand, and then moved on before she could respond. He did this again and again, distributing his illegal medications in the midst of an evacuation, using the chaos as cover to complete his mission. It was reckless and brilliant and completely insane, and Marcus found himself respecting the man's commitment even as he knew it was wrong. But something was bothering Marcus. The fire. The timing. He pulled out his phone and called the fire department's emergency line directly, using his police credentials to get information. "The fire is in the food court," the dispatcher told him, "a grease fire that spread to the ceiling. But our teams are already on scene and they're reporting something weird. The fire seems to be contained to one specific area, almost like it was deliberately set, but designed not to spread. It's under control already." Deliberately set. Marcus's mind raced. He looked at Rex, who was staring at Richard Walsh with an expression that could only be described as knowing, and suddenly everything clicked into place. The fire wasn't an accident. It was a diversion. Richard had set it, using his knowledge of building systems and electrical work to create a controlled burn that would trigger evacuation but wouldn't actually endanger anyone. He'd created the chaos he needed to distribute his medications one last time, to help the families he identified during his weeks working as Santa. It was the act of a desperate man who'd thought of everything, except the one thing he couldn't control, a police dog's ability to sense when something was wrong. Marcus made another decision. He turned away, pretending to focus on crowd control, giving Richard the space to finish what he'd started. Rex looked up at him, questioning, and Marcus could have sworn the dog understood exactly what was happening. 20 minutes later, the fire was out. The evacuation was complete, and Richard Walsh was standing in the central court, his velvet bag empty, his costume disheveled, waiting. When Marcus approached with Sarah and the mall police officer, Richard didn't run. He simply stood there, looking exhausted but peaceful. "I set the fire," he said immediately before anyone could ask. "It was controlled, designed to trigger evacuation but not spread. Nobody was hurt. I made sure of that." "Why?" Sarah demanded, her voice shaking with anger. "You put thousands of people at risk for what?" "To help the families I couldn't reach any other way," Richard replied simply. "Today was my last chance, and your officer here was about to arrest me, so I created an opportunity." The mall police officer moved to handcuff Richard, but Marcus stopped him. "Wait, let me talk to him first, alone." After some argument, Marcus managed to get 5 minutes with Richard in a quiet corner of the evacuated mall. Rex sat beside them, a silent witness to whatever would happen next. "You're going to prison," Marcus said bluntly. "Arson alone will get you years, even if nobody was hurt. Add in the pharmaceutical violations and you're looking at a decade or more." "I know," Richard said calmly. "It was worth it." "Was it?" Marcus challenged. "Because now you can't help anyone. Now those families you care so much about lose their secret Santa forever. Now the system wins and you lose." "Maybe," Richard acknowledged, "but 17 families have medications they couldn't afford. Medications that will give them time, that will reduce their pain, that might even save lives. That's 17 more than if I'd done nothing." Marcus felt frustrated rage building in his chest. "You arrogant bastard! You think you're the only one who can help? You think your illegal medications are the only answer? No, Richard said quietly, but they were the answer I could provide, and I did. Now someone else will have to find another way. Rex whined softly, and both men looked at the dog. Those intelligent eyes moved between them, and Marcus had the distinct impression that Rex was disappointed in both of them. Disappointed in Richard for being so reckless, and disappointed in Marcus for not finding a better solution. There has to be a middle ground, Marcus said more to himself than to Richard. There has to be a way to help these families without destroying yourself in the process. If you find it, tell me. I'll have plenty of time to think about it in prison. Before Marcus could respond, his phone rang. It was Sarah. Marcus, you need to see this. Right now. He found her in the security office, surrounded by other officers and security personnel. She pointed to her tablet, and Marcus's eyes widened. It was a news article that had just been posted online, published by a local investigative journalist. The headline read, "Santa's Secret: How One Man Tried to Fix a Broken Healthcare System." The article was detailed, thorough, and clearly based on information from someone who understood Richard Walsh's operation intimately. It explained what Richard had been doing, why he'd been doing it, and included anonymous testimonials from families he'd helped. It painted him as a tragic hero, a man driven to illegal action by a system that let children suffer for lack of money. He planned this, Sarah said, her voice full of awe and anger. He tipped off the journalist, probably weeks ago. He wanted his story told, wanted public pressure to protect him. And it was working. Marcus could see it already in the comments section, in the social media shares that were multiplying by the second. People were outraged, but not at Richard. They were outraged at a healthcare system that drove a widower to become a criminal just to help dying children. By the time they brought Richard Walsh out of the mall in handcuffs, there were news cameras waiting. By the time he was processed at the police station, there were protesters gathering outside. And by the time the district attorney had to decide whether to prosecute, public opinion had made the choice politically toxic. Richard Walsh eventually pled guilty to reduced charges and received a suspended sentence with community service. The judge, reading the political winds, gave a speech about how the real crime was a healthcare system that put families in impossible situations. Richard was ordered to work with legitimate pharmaceutical assistance programs, using his knowledge to help people legally. It wasn't the ending Marcus had expected. It probably wasn't the ending Richard had planned, but it was the ending they got. 3 months later, Marcus sat in his living room with Rex curled up at his feet, reading an article about new legislation being proposed to make expensive medications more accessible. The article mentioned Richard Walsh by name, crediting his case with raising awareness about the issue. "What do you think, boy?" Marcus asked the dog. Rex looked up at him with those wise eyes, and Marcus had the distinct impression that he was disappointed in both of them. Disappointed in Richard for being so reckless, and disappointed in Marcus for not finding a better solution. "There has to be a middle ground," Marcus said more to himself than to Richard. "There has to be a way to help these families without destroying yourself in the process. If you find it, tell me. I'll have plenty of time to think about it in prison." Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message. It was Sarah at the mall. "You'll want to see this. Our new Santa started today. Guess who recommended him? Richard Walsh. The guy is apparently a retired pediatric nurse who volunteers with children's hospitals. Walsh connected him with us before his case went to trial. Said we needed someone who really understood the kids." Marcus smiled. Even while facing prosecution, Richard had been thinking about the children at the mall, making sure they'd have someone good to share their Christmas wishes with. Maybe he figured it out after all, Marcus said to Rex. Maybe he found that middle ground between helping and destroying yourself, working within the system while pushing for it to be better. Rex's tail thumped against the floor, a sign of approval. The mall incident became something Marcus thought about often in the years that followed. It reminded him that his job wasn't just about enforcing laws, but about understanding people, recognizing complexity, and sometimes showing mercy even when it wasn't strictly by the book. And it reminded him that Rex wasn't just a tool for detecting threats, but a partner whose instincts understood human nature better than any training manual could teach. The dog had known that Richard Walsh was carrying more than illegal medications in that velvet bag. He was carrying hope, desperation, love, and a belief that one person could make a difference even when the system said it was impossible. On Christmas Eve of the following year, Marcus and Rex did their usual mall patrol. When they passed the Santa's workshop, the new Santa waved and smiled. He was good with the kids, patient and kind, and the line of children waiting to share their wishes stretched around the corner. It was different from Richard Walsh's operation. Legal, sanctioned, safe. But Marcus couldn't help wondering about the families who were struggling, who couldn't afford the medications their children needed, who were facing impossible choices. "Come on, boy," he said to Rex. "Let's finish our patrol." But as they walked away, Marcus made a mental note to look into those pharmaceutical assistance programs Richard had been ordered to work with. Maybe there was a way Marcus could help too, could volunteer his time or donate resources, or do something to address the problem that had driven Richard Walsh to such desperate measures. Because in the end, that was the real lesson of the Santa who ran. Not that breaking the law was justified, but that everyone had a responsibility to fix broken systems, to help people in need, to do what they could with the resources and knowledge they had. And sometimes that meant a police officer trusting his dog's instincts more than the letter of the law. Sometimes it meant showing mercy to people who deserved punishment, but also deserved understanding. Sometimes it meant recognizing that the world was more complex than right and wrong, legal and illegal, good and bad. As they left the mall that evening, snow was falling again, soft and white and beautiful. Rex stopped to catch a few flakes on his tongue, and Marcus laughed at the simple joy of it. "Good boy," he said, scratching behind the dog's ears. "You're the smartest partner I've ever had. Even when I don't understand what you're trying to tell me, you're usually right." Rex looked up at him with those wise, knowing eyes, and Marcus felt grateful for the privilege of working with such an extraordinary animal, a dog who could detect explosives and drugs, but also understand human intention and moral complexity, a dog who knew when to alert and when to question, and when to simply bear witness to the complicated ways people tried to do good in a difficult world. The case of Richard Walsh became a teaching moment at the police academy, though not in the way Marcus expected. It was used in classes about discretion, about understanding context, about recognizing that law enforcement required both strict adherence to rules and the wisdom to know when situations demanded more nuanced responses. And somewhere in another city, Richard Walsh was working with a legitimate pharmaceutical assistance program, using his chemistry knowledge to help families navigate the complex system of medication access. He was doing it legally now, with oversight and support. But he was still helping, still making a difference, still being, in his own way, Santa Claus for families who needed a miracle. Marcus never saw Richard Walsh again after the trial. But every Christmas Eve, when he and Rex did their mall patrol, he thought about the man in the red suit who'd carried hope in a velvet bag, who'd broken laws to help children, who'd trusted a smart police dog to understand what he was trying to do. And every Christmas Eve, Rex would pause when they passed the Santa's workshop, his nose twitching, his eyes scanning the crowd, looking for families in need, looking for people who required help, looking for the complexity and compassion that made his job about more than just detection. Because in the end, that's what both of them had learned. That being good at their jobs meant being good at understanding people, at recognizing that right and wrong weren't always clear, at trusting instincts and showing mercy and working to make the world better in whatever ways they could. The Santa who ran had taught them that, and neither Marcus nor Rex would ever forget the lesson.